The Prince's Secret by InMyArmsAgain, which can be found for you on fanfiction.net. Chapter 8: The Importance of Maintaining Your Dignity. Rose rubbed the last of the sleep from her eyes as she carefully descended the steps, heading for the great hall. She shook her hair out of her face, lacing her fingers together and cracking her knuckles. She softly chuckled at the sharp noise. Though a little groggy, she felt worlds better after having 8 hours of uninterrupted slumber. Hopefully today would also be better, if the dewy sunlight was anything to go by. She took in a deep breath at that pleasant idea. Beside her, Harry attempted to not drag his feet. The head boy had overslept slightly after a long night of procrastinated reading, and had been relieved to stumble across Rose in the common room. He praised some higher power that he wasn't the last one in the tower. I tell you, Rose, he yawned, that's the last time I leave herbology reading until the night before. You know you've said that, said Rose, and you never learn. What if I said that I was serious this time? Harry, you're a nice guy, but you can be a piece of work sometimes. You should stop hanging around Hermione, Rose. You're starting to sound like her. You see, that's what I mean. Maybe you should lay off Weasley for a while. Do you know how wrong that just sounded? Rose thought for a moment, but her face suddenly went blank as their feet touched the stone floor that led to the great hall. Harry struggled to contain his laughter as he stared at her terrifically funny expression. Rose also had started to laugh at herself, closed eyes falling to the floor. Harry, do me a favor and forget I ever said that, she said. No problem. Harry yawned again. The brief moment of lethargic relapse caused Rose to also yawn widely, covering her mouth with the back of her hand. They continued around the corner to where breakfast waited for them. Both were jogged out of their waking twilight when they were met by a small crowd of their young housemates. Voices were raised until they steadily became white noise, sounding everything from excited to plain confused. How did it happen? What'd you do? What did you do to Snape? Hey, hey, cool it! Harry shouted above the kids, drawing the attention of other students around them. What are you all talking about? Look at our points! A little blonde second year pointed up to the front of the hall. Both Harry and Rose followed his hand, and both let their jaws hit the floor at what they saw. The extra jar of rubies that presented 100 non-existent points had vanished, and their glass had leveled out. They were out of the negative range again. They had pushed through the crowd of children and rushed over to where Ron and Hermione sat with their contemporaries. When did that happen? Harry asked as he, not so subtly, pointed to the hourglass. My guess would be last night or early today, said Hermione, buttering a slice of toast. Miney, it's only 8:30. It had to be last night, said Ron. Hold on, last night? But that would mean Harry's finger shifted to Rose, whose eyes had gone wide with realization. Oh no, she gasped, shaking her head. It can't be. Rose, that has to be around 100 points, Parvati pointed out as the two latecomers sat down. What happened when you were in detention? Yeah, Beckett, what'd you do to level us out? Asked Dean. You ask me like I know. Rose helped herself to a bowl of cereal. And even if I did, what makes you think it was me? Don't you think it's a bit strange that we get 100 points back less than a day after you lose 300 and get detention? Asked Neville, who was pushing the last of his eggs around his plate. Anyone would suspect that you had something to do with it. Rose sighed. Anyone but me. Nothing out of the ordinary happened last night. I went there, Snape gave me orders, I spent hours cleaning up someone else's mistake, and then I left. It's just a coincidence. She was careful to leave out certain details, unsure of what would happen if it got back to Snape. Rose quickly glanced over her shoulder to pick him out of the head table, but was slightly disturbed when she noticed that the potions master was missing from among the other teachers. Must have been a hell of a mistake, said Ron, retrieving Rose's attention. Hermione said he didn't get back until almost 11. Oh, it was terrible. Rose shook her head. Abysmal failure. I feel bad for whoever's potion that was. But I'll have you know that when we get down there, none of you will be able to tell where it was. Snape made you do it by hand? Asked Harry, ripping off a bite of toast. Has he ever let anyone do it with magic? Rose asked back with a slightly cocked brow. All the more reason to be proud of a job well done. How did Snape treat you? Neville spoke up again. Did he try to ridicule the whole time? No, Neville, he and I had a lively chat about the royal family over tea and biscuits. Of course he did. But he mostly tried to ignore me, like I was just a thorn in his side or something. Lavender looked nothing but confused. Nothing happened. Yes, Lev, I believe I already made that point. Rose tucked into her cereal before continuing. What were you expecting? Snape using me for target practice? Well, it would have made more sense, asked Seamus. Please, just being in the same room was enough torture for both of us. Rose rolled her eyes. And to think that you still got, what, 16 nights left? Thank you for being so kind as to remind Rose of that, Seamus. Hermione quickly scolded. Hey, I'll leave it alone when you get us back those other 200 points. Rose growled as she sat down her spoon and rested her chin on her hands. Harry placed a hand on her shoulder and leaned in over the table. Honestly, Seamus, she'd have to give Snape a blowjob or something to make that happen. The other seventh years quickly fell silent, taking in that last comment. Ron's face turned a pale green, and he pushed his plate away. Well, that ruined my appetite. Hermione and Rose opted to stay behind when the others decided to get a head start on the walk to herbology. Rose was still quite hungry after the day before, and had decided to chase her cereal with 3 pieces of toast smothered in strawberry jam. Hermione took advantage of this, using it as an excuse to look over her finished homework for a second time. When the two girls eventually started for the greenhouse, Rose was still nibbling on pink-stained crust, giving her the appearance of a starving squirrel. They weren't in the halls for 3 minutes when Hermione spoke up. So tell me, Rose, what really happened last night? Ah, you can see right through me now, can you? Rose sighed. Well, even if you had to admit the timing of those points was very odd, and as much as I want to believe you, something just isn't adding up. Rose smirked. You're good. I'm surprised Harry didn't demand you do that 30 minutes ago. Very funny, but notice how you avoid my question. Nothing at all happened in detention? Nothing that anyone needs to know about. The red-haired witch poker-faced the brunette one. Oh, Hermione suddenly perked up, which means that there's something I need to know about. Now Rose was laughing. There's no need to get excited, Miney. Just tell me, Hermione demanded. Not now. Please? Cut it out. Don't make me deduct points, you stubborn witch. Rose almost skidded to a halt and turned around to where Hermione had stopped a second before. Quick to turn on your friends, are you, head girl? Come on, Rose. Just tell me and get it over with. Hermione tried to reason with her friend. Rose wrinkled her eyebrows as her blue eyes shifted back and forth around the hall. To Hermione, she looked uneasy and a bit careful. Do you promise to keep this quiet? Of course, whatever you say. Rose was looking around again for people when her searching eye found the door to the girls' loo. Smiling, she motioned for Hermione to follow her inside. Once the door lock clicked behind them, both girls set their books down on the sinks. Rose turned back to Hermione, who was leaning against the wall with an anxious expression. A quick look at 6 unlocked cubicle doors reassured her of their privacy. I apologized to Snape last night. You did what? Hermione raised her brow in surprise. I apologized. I heard that part. The head girl was shaking her hands at her friend. But what? You apologized to Snape? Really apologized? Yeah, said Rose. Why? Well, with all that time to think last night, it just occurred to me that it was the right thing to do. So I said I was sorry for how I acted in class. Well, I'll be. Hermione smiled. That's amazing. After all that, you came to your senses. Rose laughed softly. I know. Crikey, right? What convinced you? Asked Hermione, quite curious. Someone had to be the good guy, right? Again, Rose felt it was necessary to keep the whole truth to herself, but Hermione didn't buy that for a minute. Rose, I know you too well. Why would you say you're sorry to a man who spent the whole night bullying you? Well, Rose searched her mind for the safest explanation. Something made me change my mind. Like what? Let's just say I got the idea that Snape's day wasn't much better than mine was. Rose said this with a shake of her head. Her eyes slowly wandered up to the high ceiling. Hermione cocked her head to the side a bit, bemused. Rose seemed to understand her silent question, as she said, "It was something he said." "What was that?" asked Hermione. Rose quickly walked over to the cubicles, knocking open the doors and peering in as she passed by. Sure that they were totally alone, she walked back over to the sinks and hoisted herself up to sit on one of the rims. "Listen, Hermione, this has got to stay between you and me, okay?" she urged her friend. Hermione was unsure as to why Rose was going to such great lengths to keep all this secret, but she still tried to accept that she had some reason behind it. She nodded with a reassuring smile. Rose composed herself with a quick breath. "Snape told me that he wasn't feeling his best yesterday." She almost missed the look of utter surprise in Hermione's eyes, brown eyebrows lifting and her delicate lips parting. The red-haired witch went on further. "You should have seen him, Hermione. He looked positively awful while I was there. I mean, he never looked too good to begin with, but last night was something else." "What was wrong with him?" "I think he's got some kind of stomach virus. He hinted that he'd been feeling nauseous, but I'd be lying to you if I didn't once think he was going to be sick at any moment." Hermione shook her head, forcing an exhale. "So that explains why he's been so overbearing lately. Why didn't we think of that?" "To be honest, I thought the same thing," said Rose. "But he's been that way since we first got back. I doubt he's been ill for that long." "But what if he has?" Hermione was quick to throw out every possibility she could think of. "I don't know, Hermione," Rose shrugged. "And even if he has been sick for a while, I don't see why that should matter to us except to cause us to dread potions." "It obviously mattered to you. After all, you did apologize to him. You did that because you felt sorry for him, didn't you?" Rose, quite shocked by her friend's audacity, slid off the sink she sat on and settled on her feet. She didn't really want to admit to Hermione that the latter was right, though the reason why escaped her. She thought for a quick moment. "Be serious," she started. "I am," Hermione interrupted. "I'm right, aren't I?" Rose tried to come up with some sort of excuse, but she only realized that this was Hermione Granger she was speaking to. The brilliant girl would figure out the truth sooner or later. Rose also realized that if she had to spill her guts to someone, it would be to Hermione. She was a good friend, and good friends always allowed themselves to be talked to into the floors by others. "Yes, all right, I felt bad for him," she finally admitted. "You would too if you had heard him last night." Hermione's eyes then thinned out, a tweak tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I have to ask, Rose, did you say you were sorry because you felt a little bit guilty after finding that out?" Rose unconsciously rolled her eyes before pointing a pale finger at Hermione. "Don't you dare let that slip to anyone. I don't want people knowing that I apologized in the first place, let alone because I felt a tiny bit guilty." "I thought that was very admirable of you," said Hermione, trying to be of some help. "You do, but I don't think many others will." Rose's voice sounded like she had been discouraged by such thoughts. "If anything, people will find out I'm too soft. We're Gryffindors, and he's the head of Slytherin House. That's just embarrassing." "You've been hanging around Seamus and Dean too much," Hermione laughed. "You did the right thing, and you know it." Rose laughed along with her, but not without a little effort. She knew that Hermione was trying to make her feel good, but the mention of her housemates seemed to cast a little cloud over her mood. If Rose assumed that she would be able to tell the story to any other Gryffindor and get away with it, then she really didn't know her house. Yes, she did the right thing, but others would not see it that way. Her year mates in particular. Rose had always had her difficulties when faced with low opinions of her, no matter whose they were. It was often quite enough to have Parkinson causing her trouble for no reason, save the Slytherin's own boredom. But the last 2 days had been hell in a handbasket. Having those closest to her think such things of her was eating away at Rose's mind. She realized that most of them probably didn't know what they were doing, something that Hermione would be quick to remind her of, but that didn't stop the unsettling insecurity from creeping into Rose's usually confident spirit. Hermione was one of the very few people to ever get a glimpse of this private vulnerability, and now she was the only one left in the student body. But for Rose, it was better to only have one person see that side of her. She, like many before her, believed it was a weakness to expose yourself in such a way. Hermione would have continued in her verbal applaud if she hadn't looked down at her watch to see that they were running out of time to race to herbology. Instead, she showed her appreciation with a light hug before they grabbed their things and left the lavatory. She also reiterated that their conversation would stay between her and Rose. Ron would not hear it unless it was coming from Rose's mouth. Though her mind was cluttered with unneeded concerns, Rose thanked the high heavens that she still had one good friend to lean on these days. Severus wiped the sweat from his forehead. He could already feel the gunk building up on his scalp as he stood over a boiling cauldron. Poppy Pomfrey had requested a few crates of pepper-up and anti-flu potions, and that had kept Severus busy for most of the evening. He had just started the second batches for both. Thank Merlin that he was in a better health for the time being. He still dealt with a bout of nausea that had kept him in his quarters until the start of classes, but that was the worst of it. In fact, he felt perfectly fine by the time the befuddled seventh years shuffled into class that afternoon. Severus took great delight in such confusion, though he was a bit disappointed that he had missed their initial reactions at breakfast. Listening to Minerva recall what she saw over quiet tea just didn't do justice. The potions master was working in his classroom, with 2 potions brewing. The heat would have been unbearable in his office. When had he become so sensitive to high heat? It would have been easier to work there anyway. Beckett was due to arrive for detention at any moment, and Severus was expecting that she would follow through with her attempts to get back on his good side. It was nearly impossible for a Gryffindor to do that, and though she knew this, it didn't stop her from trying. She had arrived on time for class, apparently just as confused as her classmates. Snape was pleased with himself at that idea, but he did find it odd that the girl had trouble looking at him. No doubt that she and the dream team had a little chat. Severus rolled his eyes, like being stuck with her for several days would be made any easier with those simpletons planning ideas in her head. As the clock struck past 7, Rose rushed in as though she thought she was late. Panting lightly, she nodded her head at Snape, who had looked up from stirring one of his cauldrons. "Good evening, sir," she said, trying to be polite. "Thank you for your promptness, Miss Beckett," said Snape. He pointed to an opposite corner where nearly 20 cauldrons were stacked up. "I took the liberty of informing the first years that they would be having their cauldrons scrubbed out for them." He noticed as Rose sighed with defeat. "As you wish," she nodded. She pulled out her wand and handed it over to Snape. In turn, she got a small, hard shoe brush. She tried to suppress a smile as her eyebrows twitched. "What are you smirking at?" sneered Snape, his coal-black eyes narrowing. "I thought you would make me use something like a toothbrush." Snape rolled his eyes. That had actually crossed his mind at some point. "Miss Beckett, I don't have the time for something like that." "Oh? If you used a toothbrush, it would take you 5 days. What's the use in wasting such time on one task?" Rose's pale forehead wrinkled. "I bet I could do it in 3 days." The glare she received from Snape made Rose realize that she was challenging him. She quickly stopped talking and carried the first cauldron over to the sink. There was no way she was going to let her mouth get her in trouble again. It was awkward, very awkward. Though the room was not totally silent, the absence of speech did a number on the comfort levels of both student and teacher. They tried to stay completely focused on their respective tasks, but the unsaid tension hung over their heads. Both thought that it might have been better if they were still beside themselves with anger. It was Rose who broke the silence. "What are you doing there?" Snape glared at her. Did she have to go from ignoring him one night to trying to make conversation the next? "What does it look like I'm doing? Madame Pomfrey needed some potions made." Rose sniffed the air. "Is that pepper up?" "You should know. It was part of today's lesson." The potions master let his tired glare fall back down to his work. Rose stepped away from the cauldron in the sink, absent-mindedly letting it fill with water. She tried to peer over into the bubbling brew. "Aren't we supposed to brew that tomorrow?" "You know well that I will not tell you that," said Snape. "And even if you were brewing this, by watching me, you could be accused of cheating." The girl's eyes thinned out, clearly not amused by such an idea. "Oh yeah, as if I don't have enough detention as it is." Snape motioned to the sink and the overflowing cauldron. "Get back to work, Beckett, and leave me to my own." The young witch suppressed a growl as she ducked her hand into the water to search for the brush. 5 clean cauldrons lay to the side when Rose realized that sweat was trickling down the sides of her face. She thought the room was toasty when she first got there, but now it was sweltering. Was it necessary to have 2 intense burners going at the same time? She looked up at Snape's. She looked up at Snape. Perspiration was pouring off his temples as he carefully bottled the pepper up. He looked like his concentration would cause him to pass out. Professor, are you almost finished? Asked Rose, stripping off her robe. No mean to be rude, but it's really hot in here. Snape didn't so much as glance at her. If it bothers you so much, then why don't you dunk that pretty little face of yours into the water? I can handle it. Rose shook her head. I just wanted to know how much longer I'll be sweating off weight. Keep your knickers on, Miss Beckett. Please. Snape urged sarcastically. You've tolerated worse in my classes. You can shut up for a few hours. Rose turned back to her chore, but not before throwing a quick little sneer at her professor. Snape snarled under his breath. Half an hour passed by with more than little notice. Having packed away the doses of pepper up, Severus had to wait impatiently for the second brood to mature. Slaving over a hot cauldron for the better part of 4 hours had killed his energy, and the unrelenting heat certainly didn't help. He was debating if he should turn in for the night once he'd finished when he looked down to see that he was missing the last ingredient. He growled to himself. Of course he had to forget something in the storeroom. He was about to make a move to fetch it when he had a thought. Miss Beckett. He got Rose's attention as she vigorously scrubbing her as she was vig- bleh, as she was vigorously scrubbing her 10th cauldron. Go into my storeroom and find the bottle of crushed violet petals. Bring it to me. Yes, Professor. Rose nodded. She dropped her brush in the sink and calmly walked over to Snape's office, disappearing behind the door. Severus eased down into his hard wooden chair and leaned his elbows on the table as he cradled his head. It was so odd. He never used to be so tired in the evenings. In past years, he could work until the early hours of the morning with no trouble. Now he struggled to make it to 11 o'clock. And for Severus, demanding that a student go and fetch something for him was just ridiculous. Really, he thought, his mysterious stomach upsets were bad enough. Did it have to get much worse? A few minutes passed before Rose re-entered the room, a little blue bottle in her hand. She placed it on the table in front of Snape. There you are, sir, she said. If I can make a suggestion, perhaps you should put new labels on those jars. Some of them are pretty hard to make out. The potion's master didn't say a word. He just uncorked the bottle and tapped in a pinch of the dark-dried plant particles. The potion slowly turned a dark royal blue color. Rose went back to the sink. Snape thought for a moment, eyeing the Gryffindor. All he had to do was bottle up the anti-flu potion, and he was through for the night. He would make a sixth year carry them up to the hospital wing in the morning. But in the meantime, he had to consider his options. He would much rather be tucked up in his quarters than watch the Beckett girl wash dishes. And judging from the strength of her scrubbing, Rose wanted to get out of here just as quickly. Severus lowered the heat under the potion while he had Rose at his beck and call. Why not take advantage of it? Beckett. Rose's eyes cautiously shifted to Snape. Yes? Come here. The greasy, dark-haired wizard motioned for her to come closer. Nervously, Rose set aside her 10th clean cauldron and walked over to him. Snape stared at her tensing face. There is enough anti-flu potion here for 35 doses, and they all need to be bottled. Frankly, I don't have much desire to be trapped in here with you for much longer. Can I trust you to assist me so that we both can be out of here sooner? Yes, Professor. Anything you say, said Rose, missing the insult in the request. What do you want me to do with the rest of the cauldrons? Leave them. You can finish them tomorrow night. Oh. Rose sounded surprised. Thanks, I guess. Snape then silently summoned 2 clean ladles and handed one to the unusually awkward student. The two of them worked together at a slow pace. Anti-flu potion was a fair bit thicker than pure liquid. Sweat continued to drip off their foreheads as they filled, corked, and stored the tiny bottles. As he worked, Severus noticed that every time he would even glance at Rose, her eyes would snap away. She was also a bit shifty in her posture as she stood in front of his desk. She was acting just as, if not more suspicious than she did in class. Severus didn't need to ponder this for too long. Watching her gave it away. Something was going on in her head. Is there something you wish to say, Miss Beckett? In her mind, Rose was cursing the world because she couldn't be more discreet. But she couldn't exactly lie to Snape, because he would automatically see it for what it was. The red-haired witch held her breath. It was now or never. Uh, yes, can I ask you a question? What is it? Snape was more than a little curious. Was it you who gave Gryffindor all those points? Ah, that was it. Severus Snape was not a stupid man. He knew that after that kind of shock, this was bound to come up. It all just depended on if Rose had the guts to think of asking. His face held no emotion as he blinked slowly. Part of it, yes. He lied, not wanting to give the Gryffindor the satisfaction of the full truth. Rose's eyes widened to absurd levels of surprise. Really? Why'd you do it? Snape suppressed the urge to laugh at the look on the student's face. Now, Miss Beckett, I'm sure that you have already figured that out. That is, if someone else didn't do it for you. We've had our suspicions, Rose sighed with frustration, but I, for one, would like to have a clue about what really happened. Snape also sighed, though he couldn't quite tell if it was out of exhaustion or his disdain for Rose's persistence. He rolled his eyes as he continued his gaze back to the simmering blue liquid. If you are so desperate to know, then here you have it. It was because of your little apology last night. Was it really? Said Rose, her mouth curling into a smile. Professor Snape, I'm touched. So you forgave me after all? I never said that. The pale, sickly man watched that smile disappear as fast as it came. I merely thought it was appropriate to give you the prize you were no doubt seeking when you got up the bollocks to do that. Lord knows that none of those blundering brats you call friends would have thought of such a thing. Rose's lips thinned out. She wasn't mad at this pointless insult to her friends, but for the total misconception of herself at the end of last night's session. It was fairly obvious to her that Snape saw nothing in her than the glory horse she apparently was supposed to be. She now wondered why she even bothered to be so civil with him in the face of his weakness. That's not true. Harry and Hermione would have done the same thing if they had been in my place. Or so you think. Snape set aside the bottle he had just finished filling. I don't believe that Potter would have been so saintly in light of last night's situation. You ought to know that by now, that the lot of you never would have admitted defeat in some lengthy Hufflepuff-like explanation. Again, sir, that's not true. Irritation began to creep into Rose's voice. Just because you hardly ever see it, that doesn't mean it never happens. I admit that I was wrong. Does that mean nothing? If you ask me, you should feel lucky that I even felt sorry for you last night. So says the proud Gryffindor. Snape sneered viciously. You seem to think it's a good thing to wear your heart on your sleeve, and yet it is exactly why that had and yet it is exactly that had us standing here tonight. Since you don't seem to be in the mood to deny, surely you will admit that you did give your ego a little boost last night. I wasn't there this morning, but I'll bet you loved that attention, retelling your story to anyone who would listen. Just then there was a sudden loud yelp. Rose, distracted from her task, had let her angry eyes wander away from her ladle and unceremoniously poured a generous amount of hot potion over her fingers. She dropped both ladle and bottle as she rushed over to the sink. The bottle shattered on the floor in front of the desk. Snape shook his head as Rose ran her hand under the cold water. Rose breathed hard against the pain, trying her best to stay composed. After a few moments, she shut the water off and flexed her fingers. The burns were still quite painful, but not unbearably so. She hissed away the stinging. Good thing she had bandages in the dormitory. She turned back to the snide professor as if nothing had happened. I'll have you know that I didn't tell anyone that I did that. A black eyebrow arched as Snape stared at Rose. He certainly hadn't expected that, much less from her. Really, no one. He dared to swear that this supposed truth. No one, Rose reaffirmed. Snape did not believe her. She most likely babbled to at least one of her friends. Granger had also been oddly quiet in class, which really sparked the wizard's curiosity. But still, the confusion of other seventh years suggested that they really didn't know what Rose had done. Something wasn't adding up in Severus's mind. You cannot expect me to believe that you did not tell one single person. I've heard talk that you were so kind to retell your side of yesterday's story. Rose reached for a bottle, avoiding looking at Snape in his obsidian eyes. Contrary to popular belief, I'm not overly fond of that kind of attention. Say that to my face, Snape demanded, boring into the witch's pale face. Rose did not falter. She merely blinked as she snapped her head in his direction. Being the center of attention is not my favorite pastime, and I usually don't go looking for it. And even if I do, it certainly isn't for arrogance. You don't say, said Snape. I don't think I've met a bigger hypocrite than you at the moment. Rose carefully grasped her ladle, wincing as the metal touched red skin. As I was not in my right mind yesterday, I would not count that as intentional. Miss Beckett, that is horseshit. Rose couldn't stop herself from flinching at the professor's sudden swear, but shock was quickly forgotten as fury shot up her throat, her eyes burning. Snape continued. Sooner or later, you are going to have to put an end to this pointless denial, if I can even still call it that. You knew exactly what you were doing all of yesterday, and no headache or amount of frustration can justify that. The Gryffindor would have broken another bottle if she hadn't caught herself. Instead, she gently sat down the delicate glass, colored by the brew. But then Rose took a step back. So now you're calling me a liar? She said in a low voice. I don't believe I said that. Rose had gone. Snape had gone back to his share of the work. Although I have to say it would be incredibly stupid to believe every word that comes from a child's mouth. All right then, if you want proof, then why don't you come and get it? Rose hopped up to sit on the nearest student desk. Harry tells me that you can read minds. The weary potions master was taken aback, nearly dropping one of his own bottles. My, this girl certainly had gotten sassy as of late. But what the hell did he have to do to put an end to it? He silently contemplated a word with Minerva when opportunity presented itself. Nice to know that Potter is still trying to get you ahead in your defense training, he said, Potter's name oozing with venom. Don't turn this on Harry, warned Rose. I'm serious, sir. If you are Legilimens, then why not use it on me, right here, right now? The truth was that legilimency took too much effort that Severus really did not have. And yet again, he felt that he didn't have to invade Rose's thoughts. Her face said it all. It's simple, he said. It's because you are weak. Not much better than your dear friend Potter, when I think about it. It would be too easy, just a waste of time and magic. Rose opened her mouth to fire back, but the words were caught in her throat. She didn't know the depth of magical skill involved in legilimency and occlumency. Whatever scrappy knowledge she had came from prophet pages and the aforementioned wizard hero. If she knew anything, it was that so few had these abilities, and among these few were some of the greatest wizards to ever live. For Snape to say that legilimency would be too easy on her, it was as though he was commenting directly on her abilities. To Rose, it felt like he was calling her a bad witch, mediocre at best. Rose felt her fiery anger quenched by cold hurt. She slid off the desk. All right, Professor, you win, she said as she grasped her ladle. But I'm not weak. Snape simply rolled his eyes at her. The awkward silence of before soon returned, but neither the witch nor the wizard made any effort to change that. Rose didn't want to take any chance in pouring faster. One blistered hand was enough. Yet she still wished that she had not said such stupid things to make being with Snape any more unsettling. The potions master, looking very tired and very hot, seemed to have taken to disregarding her careful help. She didn't really expect for him to say any more that evening. She gathered several sealed bottles in her hands and walked them over to the box that held the rest in the stock. If I might ask, Rose almost jumped at Snape's low voice, just why didn't you tell the whole school that you apologized to me? Rose wasn't sure of how to answer. On one hand, she wanted to protect her humility, but even she had to admit that it was only a half-truth. There were some things that even Hermione couldn't hear. She took a short breath. If I'm honest, it was because of you, she said, and the words, unsaid slowly, found their way into the surface. It would have been impossible to tell people without also telling them why I did it in the first place. After yesterday, I thought that you could do without the unneeded attention. Severus did not cease to be surprised. He raised his eyebrows in disbelief that this young woman had remained considerate. Really? And you got nothing out of it? Well, I did save myself a ribbing from my housemates, but really, Professor, it was mostly for you. Snape was suspicious. Why do I have the feeling that this was not totally out of your own understanding? The girl offered a weak smile, shrugging. I thought that being stuck with you would be easier if you weren't angry with me again. You thought I would be angry? Are you serious? Of course I did. I mean, see how nasty you are when I'm trying to have a civilized conversation? That is merely because I find your sass and your sheer presence to be most irritating, said Snape. Rose rolled her eyes. In any case, it seemed to me that you didn't want anyone else knowing that you were ill yesterday, and it seemed to me that I could spare myself another week's detention if I kept my mouth shut. The two of them silently packed the filled bottles into the wooden box bound for the hospital wing. Rose dabbed the sweat from her face, letting lazy eyes fall onto Snape. The wizard seemed to grasp his desk, and perspiration had given his face and hair a sickly shine. The man looks about ready to faint, Rose thought. She was still looking at him when he let out a deep sigh and met her gaze. Is it safe to assume that you will stay quiet about tonight as well? Rose nodded. Yes, sir. You have my word. Good, because I have something to say to you. Rose was confused, wrinkling her fair eyebrows. Snape was uneasy as he glanced around the room, as though the Bloody Baron had a habit of floating through at this hour. Then he said, I appreciate that you thought more than just yourself. You were right to believe that I did not want attention drawn to myself. Given the circumstances, it was noble of you to respect my privacy. The 18-year-old student was totally unsure of what to say at first, but after a moment of serious pondering, her lips tugged into a little smile. You know, Professor, I won't think any less of you if you just say thank you. The sneer that she received told her that this was wishful thinking. Snape waved his hand at the empty, filthy cauldron floated over to the sink. You can scrub that out, and then you can go, he said, attempting to wipe the layer of sweat from his face. He eased down into his chair. Before Rose went to recover the wet shoe brush, she looked again at her teacher's sickly face and hollow eyes. Not stopping to think, she asked, Professor Snape, would you mind if I used my wand for a second? Not until that cauldron is clean. Then would you do me a favor and summon a glass? You have some nerve, Beckett. Snape rolled his black eyes and snapped his wand through the air. A goblet flew out of his office and over to his waiting hand. He held it out to Rose, who had already walked over to retrieve it. She then briskly went to fill it with water. Severus sighed. After sweating in that uniform, of course she would be thirsty. That reminded him of how slow and light-headed he was feeling at the moment. In his head, he was commanding the Gryffindor to just drink her water and hurry up already. He rested his head in his hand, but then he heard a clink. Severus looked up to see the goblet of cool water in front of him. Rose was already gliding back to the corner, adjusting the ribbon that held her ginger ponytail. Drink that. You look like you need it more than I do.